The rain was relentless, battering my windshield as if trying to erase the world outside. It was one of those nights where everything felt like it was moving too quickly, yet not fast enough. My shift at work had dragged on, leaving me utterly exhausted. My only desire was to get home, curl up in bed, and let the world fade away for a few hours. It was a stormy night, the kind where the skies were lit with brief flashes of lightning, and the roads were deserted, as if everyone knew better than to be out in such weather. The monotonous sound of the rain hitting the roof of my car became hypnotic, lulling me into a state of uneasy calm. I had driven this road hundreds of times before. It was a stretch of highway that cut through a dense forest, the kind of road that felt endless, especially when the world outside your car was reduced to nothing but streaks of water and shadows. Every now and then, the trees would thin out, giving way to vast, open fields, but the sense of isolation was ever present. It was just me and the rain. Halfway home, I saw her. At first, she was just a shape in the distance, barely visible through the downpour. A figure, drenched to the bone, standing by the side of the road, waving her arms frantically. I squinted, trying to get a better look. She was young, maybe in her 20s, with long, dark hair plastered to her face. She wore a simple white dress that clung to her body, completely soaked. I'm not usually one to pick up hitchhikers, especially not in the dead of night, but something about her seemed off, desperate. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and pulled over. I couldn't just leave her out there in that storm, could I? She opened the passenger door and climbed in, her body trembling from the cold. Water dripped from her hair onto the seat, and she wrapped her arms around herself, trying to warm up. I handed her a towel I kept in the back seat, and she took it with shaking hands. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding rain. I didn't think anyone would stop. I gave her a small, tight smile. "No problem. What are you doing out here in this weather?" She hesitated, her eyes darting to the window. "My car broke down. I've been walking for hours." I nodded, glancing at the road ahead. "Where do you need to go?" She gave me an address that's not far from my route. I nodded again, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than necessary. Something about her seemed strange. She was quiet, too quiet, and her responses were short, almost rehearsed. I told myself it was just the storm, that she was probably shaken from being stuck out there alone, but the feeling of unease gnawed at me, making it difficult to focus. The temperature in the car began to drop, though the heater was on full blast. I adjusted it again, but it didn't seem to make a difference. The cold crept into my bones, and I couldn't shake the chill. I glanced at her out of the corner of my eye. She was staring straight ahead, her expression unreadable, her face pale in the dim light of the dashboard. As we drove, the rain intensified. The road ahead was barely visible, a swirling mass of water and darkness. The wipers struggled to keep up, their rhythmic squeak doing little to calm my growing sense of dread. We reached a stretch of road that was particularly dark and isolated. The trees on either side loomed like shadows, their branches swaying violently in the wind. Lightning flashed, illuminating the landscape for a brief moment before plunging it back into darkness. That's when it happened. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her reflection in the window. But it wasn't her face staring back at me. It was something else, something twisted and grotesque. Her eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to stare into my soul. Her mouth was stretched into a wide, unnatural grin, the corners of her lips curling upwards in a way that made my skin crawl. My heart skipped a beat, and I gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to keep my composure. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light, a distortion caused by the rain and the darkness. But the fear was real, gnawing at my insides, making it hard to breathe. I glanced at her again, trying to act natural. She looked the same as she had when she got in the car, pale, wet, and shivering. But the image of her twisted reflection wouldn't leave my mind. It was burned into my memory, a ghostly after-image that lingered no matter how hard I tried to shake it. We drove in silence for a few more minutes, the air in the car thick with tension. My fingers were numb from gripping the wheel so tightly, and my heart raced in my chest. I just wanted to get her to her destination and be done with it. Then she spoke. "You should slow down," she said, her voice unnervingly calm. I blinked, startled. "What?" Slow down, she repeated, her tone flat and emotionless. I did as she asked, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the fear gnawing at me, or maybe it was something else. Either way, I eased off the gas, my nerves on edge. As we rounded a bend in the road, I saw it, a fallen tree blocking the road ahead. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt just inches from the massive trunk. My heart pounded in my chest, the adrenaline surging through my veins. I turned to thank her, but she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, the towel she had wrapped around herself lying in a crumpled heap. I stared at the seat in disbelief, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. I got out of the car, the rain immediately drenching me as I called out into the storm. But there was no sign of her, no footprints in the mud, no indication that she had ever been there at all. I felt a surge of panic. I had seen her get into the car. I had felt her presence beside me. She couldn't have just vanished. Grabbing my flashlight from the glove compartment, I began searching the area, shining the beam into the trees and down the road. But there was nothing, no trace of her. It was as if she had disappeared into thin air. Shivering from the cold and the fear, I got back into the car and sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. My mind was racing, replaying the events over and over again, but they only became more confusing. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. After a few minutes, I decided to drive back to town and report the incident to the police. Maybe they could help make sense of it. When I arrived at the station, I was met with skepticism. The officer on duty listened to my story with a look of incredulity on his face. "Are you sure you weren't just seeing things?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "It's a nasty night out there." I'm telling you, she was real," I insisted, my voice trembling with frustration. "She got into my car and then she was just gone." The officer sighed, clearly not convinced. "All right," he said, nodding slowly. "We'll send someone out to check the area, but I wouldn't get my hopes up. We get all sorts of strange reports on nights like this." I left the station feeling frustrated and unsettled. The officer's doubt only made me question my own experience more. Had it really happened? Or was it just some bizarre trick of the mind? The next few days were a blur. I tried to go about my life as usual, but the memory of that night clung to me, refusing to let go. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her twisted reflection staring back at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Determined to find answers, I began researching local legends and ghost stories, hoping to find some explanation for what I had experienced. That's when I stumbled upon the story of a young woman who had died in a car accident on that very stretch of road. According to the legend, she was often seen hitchhiking, trying to find her way home. Those who stopped to pick her up would experience strange occurrences, and she would always disappear before reaching her destination. The realization sent chills down my spine. Had I encountered her ghost? Was the woman I had picked up that night the same woman from the legend? I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, but the experience had left a mark on me. A lingering fear that wouldn't go away. I avoided that road from then on, taking a longer route to and from work. But no matter how hard I tried to forget, the memory of that night haunted me. The image of her twisted reflection, the cold, empty seat beside me, the feeling of being watched. It was something I would never forget. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more spine-tingling tales, make sure to support the channel by subscribing. Don't forget to check out all our other videos for more thrilling and haunting stories.